Let me tell you something that most people missed. In June of 2026, Air Transat, Canada's largest leisure carrier, did not reduce its flights to the United States. It did not suspend them temporarily. It eliminated every single one. Gone. Not a single seat sold from a Canadian city to an American destination. Now, the headlines call this a business decision, a routing adjustment, a response to market conditions. That is not what this is. Here is the honest truth. When a national airline erases an entire country from its network, that is not a spreadsheet decision. That is a signal. And in 40 years of watching how power actually moves, not how it is announced, not how it is spun, but how it actually moves, I have learned that signals like this one carry more weight than any press conference, any summit, any carefully worded diplomatic statement ever could. George Shultz, who served as Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan and understood the architecture of American power perhaps better than anyone of his generation, wrote something in his memoir that I keep coming back to. He said the most dangerous thing a nation can communicate to its allies is not aggression, it is unreliability. Because aggression you can negotiate around. Unreliability you have to build around. Permanently. That distinction matters. It matters enormously right now. Because what we are watching unfold between the United States and Canada is not a trade dispute. Trade disputes get resolved at the negotiating table. What we are watching is something slower, something quieter, and something far more consequential. We are watching a trusted partner make a generational decision about whether the United States can still be counted on. And here is what I want you to sit with before we go any further. The $4.5 billion figure that everyone is talking about, the tourism losses, the empty hotel rooms, the airline seats that nobody booked, that number is real. Those are real businesses, real families, real communities, absorbing a real blow. But that number is also the smallest part of what is being lost. Money can be recovered, supply chains can be rebuilt, trade routes can reopen. What cannot be purchased at any price, what no stimulus package or diplomatic handshake can simply restore, is the thing that makes all of those economic relationships possible in the first place. Trust. And today, I want to talk about what happens when it breaks. Here is what the headlines are getting wrong. Every major outlet is running the same story. The tariffs went up, Canada pushed back, tourists stopped coming, and now American businesses are hurting. That is accurate. That is also incomplete. Because when you only read the surface of a story, you walk away thinking you understand it. And that is precisely when you are most vulnerable to missing what actually matters. So let me show you 3 things that got buried. The first is a legal detail that most people treated as a footnote. In February of 2026, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, to impose tariffs on a peaceful trading partner was unconstitutional. Not controversial, not debatable, unconstitutional. Now, why does that matter beyond the legal technicality? Because IEEPA was designed for genuine national emergencies, frozen assets of hostile governments, sanctions against rogue states. It was never written to be a trade negotiation tool. When the executive branch reaches for emergency powers to bypass the deliberative process of Congress on a matter of commercial policy with your closest ally, something institutional has shifted. The fabric has not torn yet, but it has been stretched in a direction it was never meant to go. That is not a partisan observation. That is a structural one. The second thing being missed is the Canada-China conversation. Washington erupted when reports surfaced that Canadian officials were holding exploratory trade discussions with Beijing. The framing in most American media was betrayal, disloyalty, a provocative tilt toward an adversary. Here is the honest truth. Canada did not go looking for China. Canada went looking for options. And there is a profound difference between those two things. When your largest trading partner, the country that shares your longest border, your language, your democratic institutions, your military alliances, when that country begins calling your sovereignty a bureaucratic inconvenience, you do not have a strategic choice. You have a survival instinct. Canada's pivot was not anti-American. It was self-preservation. And conflating those two things is not just analytically lazy, it is dangerous, because it prevents any honest accounting of what actually caused the problem. The third blind spot is the one with the longest fuse. The USMCA, the trade agreement governing the entire North American economic relationship, is up for formal review in 2026. This was always going to be a complex negotiation. These reviews always are. But every previous review in the history of North American trade agreements was approached from a foundation of at least minimal institutional trust. A shared acknowledgement that both sides had more to gain from cooperation than from confrontation. That foundation does not exist right now. And when you arrive at a negotiating table without trust, you are not negotiating, you are managing damage. Those are entirely different exercises, and they produce entirely different outcomes. Wrong tools, wrong tone, wrong timing. The tariffs were the visible wound. The Supreme Court ruling, the Canada-China realignment, and the poisoned atmosphere heading into USMCA review, those are the infections spreading underneath. And infections left unexamined have a way of becoming permanent. I want to take you back, because the most important thing I can offer you is not my opinion. It is the record. And the record, when you read it carefully, has a great deal to say about where we are right now. Let me tell you about 3 moments in American history that rhyme, not perfectly, but unmistakably, with what we are living through today. The first is 1930. Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in June of that year. The stated purpose was protection, shield American manufacturers from foreign competition, bring jobs home, put American workers first. The political logic was straightforward. The economic consequences were catastrophic. Canada retaliated within months. Britain retaliated. Germany retaliated. By 1932, global trade had contracted by 66%, not slowed, contracted. 2/3 of international commerce gone in less than 3 years. Now, economists still debate the precise role Smoot-Hawley played in the Great Depression. Milton Friedman argued it deepened and prolonged the crisis rather than caused it outright. But here is what is not debated. The retaliatory spiral it triggered was entirely predictable. The Treasury Department received a petition signed by over 1,000 American economists urging President Hoover not to sign the bill. He signed it anyway. The lesson is not that tariffs are always wrong. The lesson is this: when you use a blunt instrument against integrated trading partners without a diplomatic framework to manage the response, you do not control the outcome. You only control the opening move. Everything after that belongs to the other side. The second moment is August of 1971. Richard Nixon, facing a deteriorating dollar and a mounting balance of payments crisis, made a unilateral decision. He suspended the convertibility of the dollar to gold, effectively ending the Bretton Woods international monetary system that had governed the global economy since 1944. He announced it on a Sunday night with 15 minutes of preparation time given to allied governments. Canada was blindsided, Japan was blindsided, West Germany was blindsided. These were not adversaries. These were the countries that had rebuilt the post-war economic order alongside the United States. Henry Kissinger, in his memoir White House Years, described the aftermath with unusual candor. He wrote that the Allies' anger was not primarily about the policy itself. Many of them understood the economic logic. What they could not absorb was the manner. The fact that a decision of that magnitude, one that rewired the financial architecture their entire economies depended upon, was made without a single consultation. Kissinger's conclusion was precise. Allies can accept hard decisions. What they cannot accept, and what they do not forget, is being treated as an afterthought. Read that sentence again, and then ask yourself what it means for 2025. The third precedent is closer in time and more specific in subject. The softwood lumber dispute between the United States and Canada ran from 2001 to 2006. 5 years of escalating tariffs, counter-tariffs, legal challenges through NAFTA dispute panels, and billions of dollars in contested duties. It was, by any measure, a serious and damaging trade conflict between two allies. And yet it was resolved, not because one side won, not because one side surrendered. It was resolved because both governments, despite the friction and the frustration, maintained what trade negotiators call the minimum architecture of trust. They kept talking. They kept using the agreed mechanisms. They kept treating each other as legitimate counterparties with legitimate interests. That architecture, fragile as it was, held. And when both sides finally reached an agreement in 2006, the relationship had a platform to recover from. Here is what distinguishes that dispute from the current one. In 2001, neither government questioned the other's right to exist as a sovereign equal. Neither government suggested that the other country's identity was negotiable. The dispute was about lumber pricing formulas, not about whether Canada deserved to be treated as a nation. That distinction is not small, it is everything. Because trade conflicts, however costly, are technical problems. Technical problems have technical solutions. But when you introduce into a dispute the question of dignity, when you tell 40 million people that their country is not quite a real country, you have moved the conflict into territory that tariff schedules cannot resolve. That is where we are now. That is what the historical record is telling us. The tools that worked before are still available. The institutional frameworks still exist, barely, but they exist. The question is whether anyone in a position of authority is reading the same history I just read to you. Because the record does not leave much room for optimism about what happens to nations that ignore it. Now we get to the part that most political commentary refuses to do honestly. Because it is easy to pick a side. It is easy to say one government was right and one government was wrong and leave it there. That is comfortable. That is also useless. If you want to understand how power actually operates, not how it is justified after the fact, but how it is calculated before the first move is made, you have to be willing to sit inside the logic of both sides simultaneously. So let me do that. Let us start with Washington. Here is the honest truth about the strategic thinking behind the tariff policy, and I want to be precise here because this matters. The primary target was never Canada. Canada was the instrument. The actual objective was domestic industrial restructuring, forcing American manufacturers, American supply chains, and American capital to stop relying on cross-border integration and start rebuilding productive capacity inside the United States. The logic, stated plainly, goes like this. Decades of open trade created efficiency. Efficiency created interdependence. Interdependence created vulnerability. And vulnerability in a world where geopolitical competition is accelerating is a strategic liability. If you accept that premise, then disrupting comfortable trading relationships, even with allies, even at short-term cost, becomes not recklessness but calculation. That argument is not without intellectual foundation. Serious economists and national security strategists have made versions of it for years. But here is where the calculation broke down. Using a trusted ally as the pressure point for a domestic restructuring agenda, without explanation, without consultation, without even the courtesy of a private diplomatic conversation before the public announcement. That is not strategy. That is the strategic objective dressed in the wrong uniform. And when you send the wrong signal to the wrong audience at the wrong moment, you do not just lose a negotiation. You lose the relationship that made negotiation possible. Wrong tool, wrong target, wrong message. Now let us sit inside Ottawa's logic, because this is the part that American commentary almost universally gets wrong. The Canadian response, the boycotts, the procurement shifts, the trade diversification, the conversations with Beijing is being read in Washington as emotional reaction, wounded pride, political theater for a domestic audience. It is none of those things. What Canada is executing with remarkable discipline and surprising speed is a rational strategic pivot driven by a single realization. The realization that the foundational assumption of Canadian economic policy for the past 30 years, that the United States is a reliable, rules-based partner, can no longer be treated as a fixed constant. It has become a variable. And when your most important assumption becomes a variable, you restructure everything built on top of it. That is not anti-Americanism, that is risk management. And here is the detail that should genuinely unsettle anyone paying attention. The Canadian pivot is not being driven by government policy alone. The 91% figure, the share of Canadians who said they wanted to reduce dependence on the United States, that number did not come from a government campaign, it came from the ground up. From ordinary people making purchasing decisions, travel decisions, investment decisions, based on a cultural and psychological shift that no trade agreement can simply reverse. Prime Minister after Prime Minister did not lead this movement, they followed it. And a government that follows its population into economic nationalism is far more durable than one imposing it from above. That is a signal, not a temporary one. Now here is what both calculations, Washington's and Ottawa's, have in common. Neither side fully accounted for the irreversibility of institutional damage at the speed it actually travels. Washington calculated that economic pressure would produce concessions before the relationship permanently restructured. That calculation assumed Canada's dependence was deeper than Canada's resolve. It was wrong on both counts. Ottawa calculated that demonstrating resolve would eventually bring Washington back to the table on better terms. That calculation assumes Washington's political incentives will shift before Canada's new trade corridors become load-bearing. That outcome is not guaranteed either. Two sophisticated governments, two rational calculations, both potentially miscalibrated on the same variable, time. Because the restructuring that is happening right now, the airline networks, the supply chains, the trade relationships being built with Europe and Asia, the generation of Canadian business leaders learning to operate without American market access as a default, that restructuring does not pause while the politics catch up. It compounds, and compounding in geopolitics as in finance has a way of producing outcomes that surprise everyone who was not watching the base rate. That is not chaos, that is not emotion, that is the architecture of a relationship being quietly, methodically, and perhaps permanently rearranged. Let me bring this out of the realm of geopolitics and place it exactly where it belongs, at the kitchen table, because everything I have described, the institutional damage, the strategic miscalculations, the compounding restructuring, all of it eventually lands somewhere specific. It lands in a town in Vermont where the diner on Main Street depends on Canadian families crossing the border every weekend. It lands in a steel plant in Pennsylvania whose single largest export market just cut purchases by 50%. It lands in an apple orchard in upstate New York where the farmer is paying more for fertilizer, more for equipment, and receiving less for his product than he did 3 years ago. These are not abstractions. These are people. And they deserve to have the macro translated into the specific. So let us do that. Start with the border communities. Western New York alone recorded 3.6 million fewer Canadian crossings in the period we are examining. 3.6 million. Each one of those crossings represented a person who ate at a restaurant, filled a gas tank, stayed at a motel, bought something at a shop. The restaurants and motels and shops along those corridors do not have lobbyists in Washington. They do not have earnings calls or investor relations departments. They have payroll. And right now, payroll is the problem. Move south to Florida. 3.3 million Canadians visited the state in 2024. The Ringling Museum in Sarasota watched Canadian visitor numbers fall 59% in a single month. Fort Lauderdale real estate agents listed 35 Canadian-owned properties simultaneously with 0 Canadian buyers in the market. These are not vacation inconveniences. These are asset valuations, property tax bases, and local government revenues being quietly eroded. Go west to Las Vegas. Canadians historically account for 44% of all international air traffic into that city and contribute $3.6 billion annually to its economy, supporting 43,000 jobs. Las Vegas closed 2025 with its lowest visitor count since 2010, outside of the pandemic years. Canadian airline capacity into the city was cut by 82,000 seats in the first quarter of 2026 alone. 43,000 jobs, not in a single corporation, spread across hotels, restaurants, entertainment venues, transportation services, retail operations, 43,000 ordinary working people whose income depends on a relationship that is currently being dismantled. Now extend the frame beyond tourism. Canadian steel exports to the United States fell 50%. The American steel industry, the one the tariffs were theoretically designed to protect, depends on integrated North American supply chains that do not function efficiently when the Canadian side is retaliating. Federal Reserve research published in 2026 found that American businesses and consumers were absorbing nearly 90% of the tariff costs. Not Canada, not foreign exporters. American businesses and American consumers. Agricultural exporters in the Northeast lost approximately 2/3 of their grain and livestock sales to Canadian buyers. Bourbon producers in Kentucky and Tennessee were hit directly by Canadian retaliatory tariffs. Food prices rose because input costs, feed, fertilizer, machinery rose first. And then there is the dimension that cannot be priced at all. Canada is a NORAD partner. Canada shares signals intelligence with the United States through the Five Eyes Alliance. Canadian soldiers have fought and died alongside American soldiers in every major conflict of the past century. The trust that makes those arrangements function is not separate from the trust that makes economic relationships function. It is the same trust. It runs on the same infrastructure. When that infrastructure begins to corrode on the economic side, the corrosion does not stay contained. It spreads slowly, quietly, in ways that do not show up in any quarterly report, but that veterans of the intelligence community and the diplomatic corps recognize immediately for what they are. A fraying, not a break, not yet, but a fraying. And anyone who has worked with fabric long enough knows that a fraying, left unattended, has only one destination. The question is not whether we can afford to let this continue. The question is whether we have honestly reckoned with how much we have already lost. So where does that leave us? I have walked you through the signal that most people missed. I have shown you the legal fractures that the headlines buried. I have taken you back through the historical record, Smoot-Hawley, Nixon's Sunday night announcement, the lumber wars, because the record earns its keep precisely in moments like this one. I have tried to give you the honest internal logic of both Washington and Ottawa without flinching from the uncomfortable parts of either. And I have brought it down to the kitchen table, to the 43,000 jobs in Las Vegas, to the 35 unsold properties in Fort Lauderdale, to the farmer in upstate New York paying more and receiving less. Now I want to ask you something directly, not as a partisan, not as someone with a side to defend, as someone who has spent a long time studying what happens to institutions when the people inside them stop paying attention. The relationship between the United States and Canada did not fracture because of one policy decision. It fractured because of accumulated choices made by people in positions of authority who either did not consult the historical record, did not believe it applied to them, or simply did not care. And institutions, democratic institutions especially, do not self-correct automatically. They self-correct because citizens demand accountability with enough consistency and enough specificity that the people making decisions cannot ignore it. That is not idealism. That is how it has always worked. George Shultz understood it. Every serious statesman who left behind an honest memoir understood it. Power does not restrain itself. It is restrained by the credible, informed, persistent attention of people who understand what is actually at stake. You are those people, or you can be. So here is what I am asking: not to agree with everything I have said today. Disagreement, honest disagreement, grounded in evidence and argument, is exactly what this kind of analysis needs. Leave your perspective in the comments. Tell me where you think my reading of the precedents is wrong. Tell me what I missed about the Washington calculation or the Ottawa response. Push back with specificity. That conversation, rigorous, evidence-based, free of panic and free of tribal loyalty, is the only thing that produces genuine clarity on questions this consequential. And genuine clarity right now is not optional. Subscribe if you believe that understanding power honestly is worth your time, because the window for course correction in this story is still open. But windows, as history has shown us repeatedly, do not stay open forever.